Perfect. And I see that everyone has muted themselves. Thank you. Please keep your microphones off until we move on to the part of the conversation at the end. And again, thank you very much for being here. Today we have with us Monica Luci, PhD, who is a Jungian and relational psychoanalyst, a training analyst at the AIPA in Rome, and a lecturer at the Department of Psychosocial and Psychoanalytic Studies at the University of Essex. She has been working with torture survivors and other refugees who experienced severe political violence and fled war situations for 25 years. Among her publications and 4 books, Monica is the author of the monographs Torture, Psychoanalysis, and Human Rights, and Torture Survivors in Analytic Therapy, Jung, Politics, Culture. She is on the board of the Journal of Analytical Psychology and a member of the IAJS. Welcome, Dr. Monica Luci. I'll hand over the microphone to you.
Thank you, Chema. Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me, and thank you for the people that joined today. I see many familiar faces, so a warm greeting to you. This talk, as you know, is about contemporary wars, and we will try to delve into Jungian insight on war and terror in order to maybe understand more about modern conflicts. At the beginning, I gave the title Contemporary Terror Wars to this talk. In the meantime, I changed a little bit the title that now goes as Contemporary Terror Wars. I will explain why. I'm handling the presentation through some slides, so I'm sharing my screen. Let's see if everything is working well. Yeah. As Chema was anticipating, I will talk for about half an hour, then we will take 5 minutes break, and then again the second part of the talk. Because when we are talking of trauma or war or similar topics, of course, everything becomes very heavy and dense very soon. So in this presentation today, I will try to examine contemporary conflicts with the aim of articulating their distinct characteristics through the lens of analytical psychology. I refer to these conflicts as terror wars, a term that suggests a convergence of terror wars and the re-emergence of territorial disputes. A conversation on current geopolitical developments with my husband, Leonardo Giassi, partially inspired me the notion of terror war. He proposed the idea that contemporary wars as terrorist wars to describe the conduct of national leaders who engage in warfare reminiscent of terrorist tactics, ruthless, lawless, primarily designed to instill fear among civilian populations. His observation struck me as profound, and it has continued to resonate with me as a meaningful conceptual framework. Sorry, for some reason. Okay. Unlike non-state terrorism, however, these terror wars are waged by state actors and are coupled with territorial ambitions. This revival of conquest-oriented violence, which many assumed has been relegated to the era preceding World War II and the end of colonialism, marks a troubling historical regression. For the purposes of this analysis, I define terror wars as armed conflicts initiated by state actors in which civilians and civilian infrastructure are deliberately targeted to maximize terror and psychological trauma. These wars are typified by what Hathaway describes as unbound wars, military campaigns that exhibit blatant disregard for international humanitarian law, often flouting legal norms in an intentional display of autocratic power and impunity. As in terrorist attacks, the intended audience is the civil population, whose perception and morale are strategically manipulated. However, unlike traditional terrorism, terror wars are centrally concerned with territorial acquisition. I'm not the first one to notice that terror and territory seems to share some etymological root. Jonathan Havercroft, in his book Terror and Territory, The Spatial Extent of Sovereignty, begins with the observation that the Latin root of the word territory is unsettled. It could be either terra, referring to the land, or terrere, referring to frighten. Eldon uses this ambiguity in the etymological root of territory to explore how contemporary logics of territory are intertwined with logics of fear. As Eldon suggests, if territory does have its root in terrere, then territory could mean a place where people are frightened away from, or a space over which fear is exercised. This definition reflects how, harking back to Weber's definition of the state, a monopoly of violence must be exercised over territory for a government to be sovereign. After an introduction about the contemporary terror wars and their characterization in relation to the development of international humanitarian law, and an analysis of the material and psychological dimensions of territorial rights, a review of Jung's idea on war will be presented to investigate whether they are still helpful today to understand contemporary wars and where they can drive our insights. Given the definition I'm giving of current conflicts as terror wars, the ideas and conceptualization related to war and terror in post-Jungian theories will be explored. The presentation will end with some considerations that might offer an understanding of these conflicts, or better, the talk will end with our open space for reflections.
Monica, I'm sorry to interrupt, but we are seeing, I think, the presenter's view of the presentation. So the
really?
slide is a little smaller.
Oh, okay. I don't know why. Just let me switch one screen and stop sharing, sorry, and I will share again my screen. Sometimes, given I have more than one screen, are you seeing the same?
Yeah, the same
as
thing
before?
happened.
Yeah.
But I think it's not a big problem.
No, just a second, I'm trying again. Sorry for this technical issue. Okay. Again. Sure. Okay, now I think it should work.
Yes, that is perfect.
Yeah,
Thank you.
okay. Thank you for telling me. Okay. Contemporary terror wars. This term of terror wars is relevant to a few of our contemporary conflicts. It's relevant to the Gaza-Israel conflict, to the Russian war on Ukraine, and in certain respects to other current conflicts like Saudi Arabia's military intervention in Yemen, and maybe, we don't know yet, but the newly threatened India-Pakistan war seems to be on the same lines. Some of these conflicts are backed up by merciless political leaders of other nations, Trump being the most notable example, but also the autocratic leaders of Iran, North Korea, and others. And I have to say that also some Western countries are giving support to Saudi Arabia military intervention in Yemen. The Israel-Palestine conflict, which has spanned several decades, reached a new peak in October 7, 2023, when Hamas and other Palestinian militant groups launched a coordinated assault on Israeli civilians, kibbutzim, and young people participating in a concert in the south of Israel. This marked the first invasion of Israeli territory since 1948 Arab-Israeli War. The attack resulted in the deaths of approximately 1,400 individuals and the abduction of around 240 hostages. As of June 30, 2024, Israel's subsequent air and ground offensive in Gaza has claimed about 64,000 traumatic deaths, with women and children comprising approximately 2/3 of the victims. Furthermore, this military campaign has displaced about 2 million people, leaving over 1 million Gazans at risk of starvation and disease. Approximately 150,000 civilian structures have been damaged and destroyed, and no operational hospitals remain in northern Gaza. Israel justifies these actions by alleging that Hamas uses civilian infrastructure, such as hospitals and residential areas, as shields, operating from these locations, or subterranean tunnels which complicate adherence to international law, prohibiting attacks on such sites. As is well known, this war is part of the history of the land dispute between Israelis and Palestinians that began in 1948, more or less. Similarly, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which began in 2022, has been marked by indiscriminate violence and gross human rights violation. Russian forces have been accused of committing war crimes, including summary executions, torture, and forced disappearances, particularly in towns like Bucha and Mariupol. In Mariupol alone, 77% of medical facilities were damaged. Additionally, Russia has launched targeted strikes on Ukraine's energy infrastructure, depriving millions of essential services such as heating and electricity, especially during winter. The Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights has estimated the number of deaths of civilians or non-armed individuals in Ukraine at 12,900 since the start of the war on February 2022. The use of advanced weaponry, such as long-range glide bombs and explosive drones, has contributed significantly to this toll, blurring the distinction between civilian and combatant roles. The rise of digital warfare further complicates this distinction. Ukrainian volunteers, numbering over 400,000, have coordinated cyber attacks on Russian infrastructure, further entangling traditional lines between combatants and civilian actions. The mistreatment of prisoners of war through torture and executions by the Russians has also been documented. Russian-occupied territories have witnessed widespread abuse, including forced assimilation, property confiscation, political repression, disappearance of children, indoctrination of children, suppression of religion freedom. The Russian invasion was driven by a supposed belief that Russia had rights to the eastern regions of Ukraine, and throughout the conflict there were assertions made about the ambition to take control of the entire nation. Saudi Arabia military intervention in Yemen, which began in 2015, is another example of conflict characterized by severe violations of international humanitarian law. Saudi Arabia, leading a coalition against the Iranian-backed Houthi rebels, has conducted airstrikes on civilian areas, including markets, funerals, hospitals, killing over 6,000 civilians and wounding at least 10,000 more. The destruction of critical infrastructure, such as water treatment plants, has led to widespread disease outbreaks, including a cholera epidemic that claimed thousands of lives, many of them children. These actions underscore the deliberate targeting of civilian populations, often with the tacit or active support of powerful international allies, including US, UK, France, and others. Yemen's position in the Arabian Sea, Gulf Aden, Red Sea, and other strategic islands give it a direct vantage point, serving as a key gateway connecting the Indian Ocean and Arabian Sea to the Mediterranean Sea, thus controlling major trade and oil route between the East and the West. Consequently, Yemen has become a battleground for competing regional powers seeking to assert their dominance. Saudi Arabia and Iran have been vying for control over Yemen's strategic location to consolidate their regional influence and superiority. Although the United States is not currently involved in a conventional war resembling the terror-driven campaigns of Russia or Saudi Arabia, its recent foreign policy decisions, especially under President Donald Trump, reflect a different but still concerning manifestation of conflict and destabilization. Trump's approach to international relations has been marked by a sharp departure from multilateral cooperation and established diplomatic norms. Throughout his campaign and presidency, Trump strongly opposed international alliances and agreements. He accused allies of exploiting the United States, particularly criticizing NATO members for not contributing enough to mutual defense. He also claimed China manipulated trade arrangements to the detriment of the US and lamented America's involvement in prolonged conflicts abroad, pulling American troops out of several countries. These policies marked a turn toward isolationism and unilateralism, a stark contrast to the interventionist stance of previous administrations. Domestically, Trump's administration is known for bypassing congressional authority, ignoring judicial constraints, and engaging in controversial symbolic actions, such as renaming landmarks and intensifying deportation efforts. These deportations included not only undocumented immigrants, but in some cases naturalized citizens, reflecting a broader strategy of instilling fear and asserting territorial dominance. His approach to international relations, characterized by confrontation, unpredictability, unexpected shift in position, blatant disregard, and unprecedented insults in the realm of international diplomacy, has disrupted long-standing alliances, compounding global instability and made it difficult even to understand news, impeding whatever prevision in the international political scenario. Although less overtly militarized, his political strategies have mirrored the broader trends of terror-driven governance by undermining legal norms and exploiting fear as a tool of influence. His statement regarding ambitions of conquering Greenland and Canada reflect a political tendency that align with the recurring themes of terror wars, terror in population, and territorial conquest. From the war on terror to contemporary terror wars, what led to the breakdown of international humanitarian law? In her 2024 analysis, Professor Hathaway examines the historical development and recent decline of international humanitarian law, particularly since the start of the war on terror after 9/11 attacks. Initially designed to protect civilians from the devastation of war, international humanitarian law was significantly strengthened after World War II throughout the 1949 Geneva Conventions and their additional protocols. These codified prohibitions against targeting civilians, emphasized proportionality and precaution, and required combatants to differentiate between military and civilian targets. However, Hathaway argues that recent conflicts, such as those in Syria, Ukraine, and especially Gaza, show a disturbing erosion of these standards. Historically, early concepts of the laws of war, developed by thinkers like Hugo Grotius, were rudimentary and allowed many practices considered unthinkable today, including civilian killing, pillaging, and rape. Over time, these were replaced by more developed conventions like the Geneva Conventions, which sought to enforce protection for non-combatants. Despite these advances, the shift from traditional state-on-state conflicts to asymmetric warfare with non-state actors like Hamas and ISIS has made the Geneva Convention less applicable, particularly for internal or non-international conflicts. A key limitation is that only Common Article 3 of the Geneva Convention applies to internal conflicts, which complicates the protection of civilians. After 9/11, the US significantly expanded the concept of self-defense under international law to include military responses against non-state actors, which was previously unprecedented. This shift altered the threshold for military engagement and led the US and its allies adopting broader interpretation of international humanitarian law principles. One key challenge in modern warfare is identifying lawful targets, as civilians may intermittently participate in hostilities, blurring the line between combatants and non-combatants. In 2009, the International Committee of the Red Cross attempted to clarify that civilians lose protection only during direct participation in hostilities, but ambiguities remain. The concept of dual-use infrastructure, which includes civilian sites with military applications, has also expanded. Civilian structures like oil refineries, hospitals, even schools can be targeted if they contribute to the adversary war effort. The principle of proportionality still requires that such attacks avoid excessive civilian harm compared to the military advantage gained. However, countries like the US and Israel have adopted broader interpretations of proportionality. For example, the US Department of Defense Law of War Manual permits targeting any economic activity that sustains the enemy, while Israel has justified similar actions in Gaza, where it frequently targets civilian infrastructure based on the claim that Hamas uses urban areas for military purposes. This expansion of what constitutes a legitimate military target, particularly in Gaza, is a central example of this erosion. Israel's justification for targeting civilian infrastructure as dual use often overrides the legal requirement to assess proportionality on a case-by-case basis. Israel logic, which argues that civilian deaths are outweighed by the existential threat posed by Hamas, undermines the foundational principle of international humanitarian law that civilians shouldn't be targeted. The ongoing Israel-Hamas conflict starkly highlights this breakdown of the international humanitarian law, with both parties violating it. Hamas has used civilian infrastructure for military purposes and taken hostages, while Israel has conducted devastating operations in densely populated areas, restricted humanitarian aid, and launched a large-scale invasion of Gaza. Otherwise, analysis underscore that the strength of international law depends on the commitment to uphold it. Without strong enforcement and a recommitment to its core values, its promise to protect the innocent in times of war may fade, with severe consequences for global security and human dignity. Territorial rights, material and psychological dimensions of conflict. Territoriality is not merely about physical space or access to resources. It is deeply rooted in psychological processes and collective identities. While territorial disputes often manifest as political or military conflicts, they are underpinned by emotional attachments to place and shared group identities. Thus, territorial rights represent both material entitlement and psychological investments, making them susceptible of both physical and symbolic threat. Place attachment refers to the emotional bonds individuals and communities form with specific locations. This concept can be divided into two dimensions: place dependence, which concerns how a location fulfills practical needs, and place identity, the symbolic and emotional meaning a location holds. These attachments are not formed in isolation. They are nurtured within social context and often contribute to the construction of individual and group identities. When groups collectively identify with a territory, they develop a sense of collective psychological ownership, a belief that the land rightfully belongs to them, even in the absence of legal entitlement. This belief may stem from perceived historical claims, ancestral presence, or continuous occupation. The strength of such attachments often influences a group's willingness to defend, reclaim, or resist ceding territory. Territorial rights serve practical and symbolic functions. Practically, they provide spaces for political participation, safety, and social organization. Symbolically, they anchor identity and collective memories, creating a powerful sense of belonging and continuity. These dual functions render territorial rights particularly resilient to external negotiation or compromise. Montiel and colleagues identify three main levels at which territorial conflict occurs: global, international, and community-based. At global level, these involve power asymmetries where dominant states invade or control sovereign nations. Examples include Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022, the US invasion of Iraq in 2003, or looking at the past, at the Cold War era, occupations of Afghanistan by both the Soviet Union and then the United States. Although such interventions are often justified on political or moral grounds, such as spreading democracy or fighting terrorism, they typically aim to expand geopolitical influence and access to strategic resources. At the international level, these conflicts arise between nation-states over disputed borders. One example is the territorial dispute between China and Japan over the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands, which escalated after resource discoveries in the East China Sea during the 70s. China's claims at that time over much of the South China Sea have also led to friction later with Vietnam, Philippines, and other Southeast Asian nations. Other notable examples are Israel and Palestine, Saudi Arabia and South Yemen, India and Bangladesh, India and Pakistan, and many others. At the community level, at the local level, conflicts often involve indigenous or marginalized communities, fighting for ancestral lands and autonomy. Border communities may engage in disputes over natural resources, such as the shared water resources between Ethiopia and Eritrea, or the tribal clashes in Libya. Ethnic and regional movements reflect long-standing grievances tied to the dispossession and unequal governance. These conflicts demonstrate that control over land often determines access to political, material, and economic resources. Consequently, disputes are rarely resolved solely through legal means. They also require addressing deep-seated psychological and historical grievances. The psychological underpinning of territorial conflict. Territorial disputes are often experienced not only as threats to material interests, but as challenges to collective identity. Social identity theory posits that individuals derive a significant part of their self-concept from group memberships. When land is integrally tied to group identity, any threat to territorial control becomes a threat to a group existence and historical narrative. This connection is evident in the concept of collective memory, wherein shared historical experiences and traumas are linked to specific places. These memories are often embedded in rituals, oral histories, and symbolic landmarks, reinforcing the belief that the land is rightfully ours. As a result, groups may resist compromise even when faced with viable alternatives. Territorial identity also leads to categorical ownership claims, whereby groups justify their entitlement using three main narratives. The first is possession, we were here first. The second is formative contribution, we developed the land. And the third, group identity, this land is who we are. These justifications are commonly used by both aggressors and defenders in territorial disputes. The conflict between Israel and Palestine illustrates how overlapping territorial identities can lead to enduring strife. Both groups claim historical, cultural, religious ties to the same land. Their spatial proximity, coupled with incompatible national narratives, has resulted in monolithic identities, a fusion of ethnic, religious, territorial claims that make mutual recognition difficult. Each side views the other's claim as illegitimate, creating a zero-sum dynamic. Similarly, Russia's claim over Crimea and eastern Ukraine hinges on narratives of ethnic and linguistic continuity. Russia asserts that these regions belong to its cultural and historical sphere due to the presence of Russian-speaking populations. Ukraine, on the other hand, emphasizes its post-Soviet sovereignty and the integrity of its national borders. Both sides invoke competing histories to bolster their psychological ownership claims. Empirical studies confirm that strong perceptions of collective ownership correlate with lower willingness to engage in negotiation and concessions. This belief reinforces exclusionary policies and hardline stances, often escalating conflicts rather than resolving them. In territorial disputes, perceived threat to land are experienced as existential threat to the in-group. This dynamic intensifies group cohesion, but also deepens intergroup hostility. Aggressor groups may overlook the emotional and cultural significance of land to the occupied group, leading to what Montiel and colleagues term identity devaluing practices. Such disregard exacerbates resistance, fuels insurgencies and entrenches divisions. Territorial rights are complex constructs that merge material entitlement with emotional, historical, and identity-based claims. Conflict over territory are rarely about land alone. They are struggles over memory, over belonging, over meaning. Recognizing the psychological dimension of this dispute is thus essential for developing durable peace strategies. I would like to ask you, given that also we are a small group, if you agree with having a 5 minutes break just to, as we were foreseen, because I think the second part is even more dense. So 5 minutes, okay? Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Monica. So reconvene in 5 minutes.
Thank you. Okay, welcome back. So let's give a look at the second part where I'm reviewing Jung's ideas on war. I'm reviewing Jung's ideas on war, and I'm proposing some post-Jungian authors. I'm basically summarizing their thought, their thinking on war, on violence, on terrorism. Let's start with Jung. We can say that although Carl Gustav Jung never developed a formal theory of social phenomena such as war within the framework of analytical psychology, he had an interest in the wider world, and his extensive writings contain scattered yet profound reflections on mass psychology and collective behavior. Levin's book, Jung on War, Politics and Nazi Germany, suggests that Jung was more informed and politically sophisticated than some have credited. Indeed, he evidently was interested in events and was prepared to get involved in a way he thought was appropriate. This is a quote, sorry. But he was not intervening in the public eye or theorizing explicitly, as overt action in the political world was never his focus. This is what Levin writes. Let's give a look at what Jung wrote about group psychology, especially around the topics of national psychology and the collective unconscious. Unlike Freud, who formulated clear hypotheses about crowd behavior and group psychology, Jung's political insights remain fragmented across various texts and lack systematic cohesion. Despite his political awareness and engagement with contemporary events, including both world wars, Jung didn't explicitly theorize group psychology as a distinct domain, although he was familiar with foundational works such as Gustave Le Bon's Psychologie des Fous. One of the foundational concepts in Jung's worldview, evident in the psychology of the unconscious, is the notion of a national psychology, which he conceptualized as an extension of individual psychological structures. This idea stemmed in part from the influence of Gustave Le Bon. While Le Bon highlighted the psychological dynamics of collective behavior, Jung extended this framework by positing a direct continuity between the psychic life of individuals, collective groups, and entire nations. Through the concept of national psychology, Jung advanced the idea that nations, like individuals, could be psychologically diagnosed. Although he acknowledged in Wotan the intricate nature of national fates, which surpassed individual psychologies in complexity, he introduced a new dimension by emphasizing the role of archetypes. He noted that the psychological life of nations is particularly resistant to control, observing that, quote, all human control comes to an end when the individual is caught in mass movement. Then the archetypes begin to function, as happens also in the lives of individuals when they are confronted with situations that cannot be dealt with in any of the familiar ways, end of quote. Jung further argued that archetypal processes within the collective unconscious could exert profound influence at the national level, leading to widespread psychological transformation. However, because only individuals can consciously engage and transform these archetypal dynamics, collective change must originate at the personal level. This principle remained a consistent theme in Jung's works. As he wrote in 1939, the man at peace with himself, who accepts himself, contributes at an infinitesimal amount to the good of the universe. Attend to your private and personal conflicts, and you will be reducing by 1/1,000,000 the world conflict. Jung's thoughts on war began to crystallize during the interwar years, when he moved from relatively superficial interpretations towards deeper psychodynamic explanations rooted in the collective unconscious. As early as 1916, Jung rejected economic explanation of World War I, describing it instead as an epidemic of madness. This marks a critical pivot in his thinking, from individual clinical symptoms to broader cultural pathologies. Observing the psychological trauma of defeat after World War I, Jung began to articulate a model in which nations, particularly Germany, Russia, Austria, and Italy, exhibited collective emotions such as fear, despair, and resentment. He witnessed Germany's economic ruin of educated middle classes, in other words, the collective trauma of defeat. This created panic, according to him, and prompted an uprush of archaic material, archetypes that join forces with the individual as well as with the people. Such emotional upheavals created strength and energy, but eroded old values, and the level of civilization regressed. Jung limited itself to registering the behavior of the masses as a regressed level of functioning of single individuals, in which for some reason the unconscious contents take over consciousness and manifest through religious and political forms of mass psychosis, becoming as dangerous as a heap of dynamite. Sorry, I think this is the slide. As heap of dynamite, yeah. The greatest danger about, quote, the greatest danger about unconsciousness is proneness to suggestion. The effect of suggestion is due to the release of an unconscious dynamic, and the more unconscious this is, the more effective it will be. Hence, the ever-widening split between conscious and unconscious increases the danger of psychic infections and mass psychosis. Jung likened nations in distress to neurotic or psychotic individuals, noting dissociation, disorientation, and the psychological need for a personality surrogate, projected onto a political leader or savior. Jung interpreted this projection as a defense mechanism wherein the unconscious ideal is externalized and embodied in a demagogue, often with disastrous results. He warned that modern warfare and political upheavals were not just sociopolitical in nature, but psychic epidemics, as said before. Although in Jung's work we find many references to these psychic infections, we don't find a clear, precise, or concise formulation of what they are. They seem to refer to the contagion that generates mass psychosis. Jung writes of wars and revolutions in terms of psychic epidemics. Quote, the gigantic catastrophes that threaten us today are not elemental happenings of a physical or biological order, but psychic events. To a quite terrifying degree, we are threatened by wars and revolutions which are nothing other than psychic epidemic. At any moment, several million of human beings may be smitten by a new madness, and then we shall have another world war or devastating revolution. He referred to the self's role in politics in February 1936, when he discussed the psychology of mental epidemics, of ideologies, and fanatism. Quote, I explain this mental contagion through the idea of the self, because for many thousands of years, this idea seems to have been lurking behind the screen of historical events. Now it is tangible, near. And because it is not completely detached from man, it has these peculiar effects. It is still in the unconscious, so the unconscious is activated. People nowadays are gripped by an unrest that they don't understand, so they spread their excitement. That is happening actually in Germany and has happened in Russia. Everybody is infecting everybody else with unrest, with a peculiarly vibrating unconscious. And there must be a reason for all that. It is as if something had gotten into man's unconscious and were steering there, causing infectious excitement. The more those metaphysical convictions fade or vanish, the more the energy invested in those forms drops below the threshold of consciousness. Jung came to see latent danger in groups and psychic epidemics as the most destructive threat facing man. Quote again, not by arming to the teeth, each for itself, can the nations defend themselves in the long run from the frightful catastrophes of the modern war. The heaping up of arms is itself a call to war. Rather, must they recognize those psychic conditions under which the unconscious bursts the dikes of consciousness and overwhelms it. Jung on mass psychosis and leaders. When mass psychosis occurs, the results are devastating, as the individuals who make up the infected society become, according to Jung's words, morally and spiritually inferior. Man in the group, Jung writes, is always unreasonable, irresponsible, emotional, erratic, unreliable. And worst of all, again quote, crimes the individual alone could never stand are freely committed by the group being. Another quote, wherever social conditions of this type develop on a large scale, the road to tyranny lies open and the freedom of the individual turns into spiritual and physical slavery. Furthermore, in order to compensate for this chaotic formlessness, a mass always produces a leader who infallibly becomes the victim of his own inflated ego consciousness, a numerous example in history show. Since mass suggestion plays the predominant role here, it remains a moot point whether their message is their own, for which they are personally responsible, or whether they merely function as a megaphone for collective opinion. End of quote. Therefore, in Jung, we find a mass as great numbers of individuals, a split between conscious and unconscious, an automatic functioning, and susceptibility to the suggestion of the unconscious, physical and spiritual slavery, and the emerging of a leader who speaks with the voice of the group. This causes those suffering from mass psychosis to be unaware of what's happening. There is no Archimedean point from which they can observe their collective madness. In one of his most striking formulations, Jung diagnosed modern authoritarianism as emerging from pathological group dependence on state. Again, quote, every man hangs on to the next. Every man hangs on to the next. The shepherd's staff soon becomes a rod of iron, and the shepherds turn into wolves. He saw the mass surrender of personal responsibility as a symptom of psychological infantilism that paved the way for dangerous leaders who declare, I take over the responsibility. This infantilization, fueled by inferiority complexes and resentment, led to a condition he described as hysterical neurosis, typified by projection, dissociation, and a fragile ego state susceptible to manipulation. Jung extended this diagnosis to Hitler, whose psychological profile he described as a case of pseudologia fantastica. He coined this term to indicate Hitler's psychic state. He understood this pseudologia fantastica as a hysterical disorder marked by pathological lying and self-deception. For Jung, Hitler's charisma stemmed not from rational policy, but from his own belief in his lies, which created a transparent impostor cloaked in archetypal power, able to command the fervent loyalty of millions. Jung was alarmed not merely by Hitler's delusions, but by the collective hysteria that enabled them. In his view, hysteria entailed the systematic dissociation of the self, where the shadow remains unacknowledged, thereby fueling the need for external enemies and grandiosity. Jung believed that the path forward required more than institutional reform. It demanded a profound psychological transformation. Only the acknowledgement of the collective shadow and the assumption of guilt could initiate psychic healing. Without guilt, he asserted, there can be no psychic maturation and no widening of the spiritual horizon. Yet this realization must be internalized individually, not imposed externally. For a comprehensive review of Jung's evaluation of Hitler, I'm referring to Levin's work. Levin correctly notices that, strangely, Jung makes little reference to the suggestion that Hitler was in the grip of the archetype of Wotan, which would have been consistent with his theory. Instead, he described him using the image of the shaman or the messiah, a transformation into archetypal images of what Levin detects as the archetype of the old wise man. Jung contrasted the energized, charismatic stature of Hitler as an orator with his insignificance on other occasions. He wrote of Hitler as an ordinary person who is shy and friendly man with artistic tastes and gifts. As a mere man, he writes, he is inoffensive and modest, and he has nice eyes. Jung then contrasted this side of Hitler's personality with his inflated state as a demagogue, so that, quote, when the state spirit speaks through him, he sends forth a voice of thunder, and his word is so powerful that it sweeps tougher crowds of millions like fallen autumn leaves. End of quote. In an interview in 1938, Jung gave his most detailed pre-war assessment of Hitler. With Hitler, you are scared, he says. You know you would never be able to talk to that man, because there is nobody there. In another interview in May 1939, he describes Hitler as simply what the Germans have made him. It is the key to understanding him, and also the Germans themselves. He's like a mask, but there is nothing behind that mask. Jung on the causes of war. In 1939, Jung made passing references to the German feeling of inferiority to the other European powers, and how this prompted jealousy for their place in the sun. He also suggested that as Germany was very late in acquiring an overseas empire, she lacked the experience of imperial responsibilities, which he saw as having such a maturing effect on English culture. Levin detects that Jung also briefly identified another cause of war as the connection between property, materialism, and societal instability. Once more, he offered a spiritual perspective on what might initially seem like a Marxist analysis. According to Jung, a cycle of instability emerged that heightened the likelihood of conflict, On a global scale, the insecurity characterizing the interwar period intensified a neurotic consumer desire for comfort and predictability of material wealth. This increasing dependence on material gratification gave rise to escalating demands, which in turn heightened international tensions through intensified competition for resources. Beyond this self-perpetuating cycle, Jung contended that the fundamental emptiness of consumerism rendered war an attractive alternative, a dramatic escape from the monotony of the consumer-driven existence. War then held a dark appeal, appearing more significant and intense than the unfulfilling daily lives of many individuals. This aspect of war giving a meaning and let's say a more intense taste to life will be relaunched by Hillman in his book A Terrible Love for War. This insight partly accounts for the common nostalgia for the sense of unity and purpose experienced during wartime. Having identified both materialism and idealism as sources of war, Jung further explored the psychological roots of fanaticism. He proposed that secular forms of idealism were ultimately derived from religious idealism, which focuses on Wotan. Another key factor contributing to extremism, as noted by both Freud and Jung, was the capacity to demonize the enemy. This concept built upon Jung's theory of the shadow. In 1931, he suggested that greater awareness of unconscious motivations by both individuals and political leaders could reduce such demonization, as they would be less prone to act on their own destructive impulses. Jung revisited this theme extensively in his post-war work, where he discussed humanity's innate capacity for violence and destruction as expression of a collective transpersonal potential for aggression and evil. Jung analysis deepened after World War II, particularly in After the Catastrophe, where he explored Germany's collective guilt and psychological descent. He emphasized the personal challenge of writing on the subject, confessing his own emotional involvement and moral struggle. No article has ever given me so much trouble, he writes. I hadn't realized how much I myself was affected. For Jung, collective guilt was not merely a legal or moral issue, but a psychological reality, what he called a tragic fate that implicated both the just and the unjust, who were proximate to historical atrocities. He acknowledged that Europeans viewed Germans as collective traitors to civilization, a perception rooted in the shared psychic response to national shame. In sum, while Jung never constructed a systematic theory of war, his reflections reveal a rich, psychologically nuanced approach to understanding collective violence. He interpreted war as a manifestation of unresolved psychological tensions on a national and archetypal scale, arising when the shadow is disowned and projected, and when individuals abdicate their autonomy to group dynamics. Let's give a look now to what post-Jungian's author wrote. Some post-Jungian authors wrote on war and terrorism. Of course, one of the first that comes to mind is James Hillman and the archetypal reality of war. In this book, A Terrible Love of War, James Hillman explores the complex, often paradoxical nature of warfare through a mythopoietic and archetypal lens. Eschewing conventional sociopolitical and historical analysis, Hillman instead adopts a phenomenological style of writing aimed at evoking in the reader a direct imaginative engagement with the archetypes he examines, particularly that of Mars here, the Roman god of war. His intent is not merely to explain war, but to allow the reader to experience the mythic, psychic, emotional realities that underlie human fascination with and participation in violence. At the heart of Hillman's thesis is the unsettling proposition that war is not an aberration of human behavior, but rather a fundamental, even natural condition of existence. Drawing on the philosophical insight of Heraclitus, who declared that war is the father of all, and Hobbes, who saw the state of nature as a war of all against all, Hillman posits that peace is the exception rather than the rule. War, he argues, is normal, not because it is inherently rational or just, but because societies have come to accept and even valorize it. As he writes, war couldn't happen unless there are those willing to help them happen. Despite conscription and coercion, many join willingly, compelled by the deep-seated psychic forces and cultural narratives. Hillman delves into the psychological appeal of war, highlighting its capacity to confer a heightened sense of vitality and belonging. Citing the historian Stephen Ambrose, he notes that the crucible of battle often forges profound bonds, bands of brothers, and elicits extraordinary acts of selflessness and courage. These experiences suggest that the horrors of war may paradoxically reveal the noblest aspect of human nature. The proximity of death, Hillman argues, can render life more vivid and meaningful. This ambivalent dynamic is illustrated through the mythological entwinement of Mars and Venus, war and love. In classical mythology, these two deities are not opposed but intimately linked. Hillman uses this image to suggest that there is a seductive allure to war, a terrible beauty that arises from the destruction of one's enemies and heighten the emotional intensity that war provides. In this context, the love of war is not metaphorical but archetypal, a binding force that emerges from the deepest structures of the psyche. But how to tame war? To tame this archetypal force, Hillman looks to cultural history, but I have to say that he's not very convincing on this side. He looks at the European Enlightenment. He idealizes this period as one in which the martial spirit was metaphorically restrained by the Aphrodisiac altar, a time when aesthetic sensibility, philosophical inquiry, and poetic imagination provided a counterbalance to militarism. It was an age, he suggests, when metaphysical truths and artistic virtues were held in higher regard than brute force. Hillman doesn't spare religion from critique. On the contrary, he indicts monotheistic religions, especially Christianity and Islam, for perpetuating war through their insistence on doctrinal unity and moral absolutism. In terms of a remedy, Hillman is ambivalent. He gestures toward a form of courageous tolerance, a moral bravery equivalent to that required in battle, as a potential antidote to the love of war. Yet he acknowledges the rarity and difficulty of cultivating such tolerance, especially when it risks social ostracism and accusation of cowardice. The deeper problem, he contends, is that war is not merely a social construct, but an archetypal reality. Renos Papadopoulos instead wrote an illuminating article on terrorism. whose meaning goes beyond, I think, the illustration of terrorism per se. He explored the psychological and sociopolitical dimension of terrorism, underscoring its complex and often paradoxical nature. Terrorism is intrinsically linked to the affective state of terror, which the Oxford English Dictionary defines as the state of being terrified or greatly frightened, intense fear, fright, or dread. Notably, the term originates from an individual emotional experience, but has come to describe a broader social political condition. The term terrorism first emerged in the 1790s, referring to specifically to the violent practices of the French revolutionary government during the period known as La Terreur, during which numerous political opponents were executed. This historical origin positions the state itself as an agent of terror. Contrastingly, contemporary definitions frame terrorism as an illicit use of force by non-state actors, targeting civilians or governments to advance political or social agendas. This inversion places the state not as the originator, but as the primary victim of violence. In my research, this is a symptom, this reversal of the victim role, when it is not this, let's say, when the state is not the perpetrator but the victim of individual violence, it is something that is should alert us about a crime that will be committed by the state. It is something that is recurrent in the history, in the political histories of nations. A more comprehensive and analytically precise definition of terrorism is offered by Schmidt, who describes terrorism as an anxiety inspiring method of repeated violent action employed by semi-clandestine individual, group, or state actors for idiosyncratic, criminal, or political reasons. Unlike assassination, the victims of terrorist attacks are not the intended ultimate targets, but function symbolically, often selected randomly or as representatives of a broader group. The purpose of terrorist attack is communicative, is to instill fear and transmit a message. The etymology of terror traces back to the Greek tromos, signifying trembling or quaking out of fear, derived from the verb tremo or treo, meaning to shiver. The term is rooted in an onomatopoeic origin, reflecting the primal and somatic dimension of the experience of fear. A fundamental characteristic of terrorism is its polarizing effect. Actions identified as terrorist by one political group may be hailed as heroic by another, illustrating the inherently subjective and ideologically charged nature of the term. Furthermore, the arbitrary targeting of individuals within broadly defined collective groups intensifies the psychological impact. Victims are often selected based solely on group identity, heightening fear through randomness and perceived innocence. The definitions imposed on these collective identities frequently fail to align with the self-perceptions of the individuals within them, thereby compounding the terror irrationality. Papadopoulos invokes the mythological figure of Pan to deepen the understanding of terror and panic. Pan, an unconventional Greek deity, often depicted with god-like features, is associated with nature, fertility, and an all-encompassing presence. Despite his parochial standing among gods, Pan embodied notions of totality, symbolized by universal appeal, and the music of his panpipes. Intriguingly, his name is etymologically linked to panic. a term originally used to describe the fear and confusion he incited during warfare. His capacity to generate disorientation and chaos metaphorically mirrors the psychological impact of terrorism. Pan's dual nature, part human, part animal, symbolizes a deeper archetypal polarity, one capable of eliciting both allure and revulsion. This intrinsic split is echoed in the psychological dynamics of terrorism, particularly in the way it fractures perceptions and induces collective paranoia or confusion. This fragmentation can be interpreted through the lens of archetypal possession, particularly the concept of unipolarity as developed by Papadopoulos. Human consciousness normally integrates multiple polarities, but in acts of terrorism, there appear to be a complete collapse into one pole, pure, undiluted, evil. Drawing on Jungian theory, Papadopoulos suggests that such acts exemplify the emergence of a unipolar archetype, devoid of humanizing features or personal content. Jung observed that exposure to evil can awaken similar impulses within the observer, highlighting a disturbing psychological truth. According to Papadopoulos, society is unconsciously enthralled by the spectacle of terrorism, an intoxicating mix of fear, fascination, and moral complexity. This psychological grip fosters an illusion of moral clarity. Individuals believe they are acting justly, while in fact they are enacting the opposite pole of pure evil, often without realizing this transformation. Thomas Singer theorized, as it is well known, the concept of cultural complexes and the archetypal defenses of group spirit, which are two concepts, I think, very helpful to understand group phenomena in situations of violence. Singer builds upon Jungian analytical psychology to explore the psychological dynamics underlying group behavior, particularly in times of collective trauma and conflict. Central to this framework is Jung's concept of the complex, which refers to emotionally charged clusters of images and ideas in the unconscious that influence both individual and relational functioning. The ego itself, a complex, is continually engaged in a dynamic interaction with other autonomous complexes, which can abruptly emerge into consciousness and shape perception and behavior. Jung described autonomous complexes as emotionally unified constellations within the unconscious that manifest through intense affect and repetitive behaviors. These complexes resist conscious integration and reinforce themselves by selectively interpreting experience to maintain their worldview. This foundational idea extends beyond the personal psyche. Anderson introduced the concept of the cultural unconscious as an intermediary layer between the personal and the collective unconscious, recognizing the importance of cultural and social forces in psychological life. Expanding this contribution, Kimbos and Singer developed the notion of cultural complexes, which are formed from transgenerational psychic content, both accurate and distorted, pertaining to social groups and cultural identity. These complexes mirror the structure and the functioning of personal complexes. They are affect-laden, tend to function autonomously, resist conscious awareness, and seek experiences that affirm a historical narrative embedded in a collective memory. They also often operate in bipolar forms, and this is important, whereby one group identifies with one pole of the complex and projects the opposing pole onto another group, facilitating collective othering and conflict. They structure emotional experience in this way and operate in the personal and collective psyche in much the same way as individual complexes, tending to be repetitive and autonomous. Cultural complexes also tend to be bipolar, so that when they are activated, the group ego becomes identified with one part of the unconscious complex, while the other part is projected onto the suitable hook of another group. Singer writes. Perry modifies Jung's model, seeing the entire psyche structured not only in complexes, but in this idea of the bipolar system or arrangement. The occurrence of an emotion requires the interplay of two complexes, and habitual emotions belong to habitual pairs. In a bipolar pair of complexes, such as the father-son complex, a person ego tends to align itself with one complex and to project the second on a suitable other person. Singer's conceptualization of archetypal defense of the group spirit emerged in the aftermath of September 11th attacks and the subsequent US response. He observed a psychological process wherein a collective trauma activates deeply embedded archetypal defenses meant to protect a society's foundational identity or group spirit. Regardless of factual basis for war, the perception of an existential threat triggers defensive responses that mobilize intense collective emotion and sacrifice. There is something autonomous and archetypically horrific that gets activated in the collective psyche, in which all sides participate, no matter who is right or wrong, good or evil, perpetrator or victim. All groups, whether armed or not, are psychologically hardwired with archetypal defenses to protect their core spirit and being. The group spirit is akin to what Jungians might call the self of the group. The group spirit forms the ineffable core beliefs or sense of identity that bind people together. Nation-states, according to Singer, have a group spirit, and their citizens often magically and unconsciously participate in it, particularly in time of crisis. Donald Kalschet postulated that in response to severe trauma, an individual develops defenses of the personal spirit. Singer suggests that groups react in much the same way. When a group has been attacked at the core of its being and values, or when a group has been corroded at the core of its being and values, archetypal defenses are mobilized to protect the vulnerable and injured group spirit. These archetypal defenses can be ferocious and inhuman. Singer suggests that these defenses serve to protect what Jungians might describe as a group self, a symbolic core of meaning and identity shared collectively. When this self is perceived to be under threat, groups may respond with extreme and inhuman actions. Individuals who identify with this archetypal defense may commit acts of violence, as we have seen with terrorism, without regard of personal or ethical considerations, acting instead as instruments of a wounded collective psyche. Those individuals identifying with the archetypal defense of the group spirit can torture people in prison, behead people, blow themselves and others up without regard for their own personal well-being or the humanity of those who happen to be in the path. Ultimately, the most extreme form of these archetypal defenses is the invocation or use of nuclear weapons, representing a potential apocalyptic endpoint to collective conflict. Such threats, whether symbolic or actual, exemplify the terrifying autonomy and destructiveness of these archetypal energies when activated within the group psyche. I'm coming to conclusions. Or better than conclusion, I would say I'm coming to the end of this talk with a few, let's say, conclusions in mind, and I would like to discuss, with you these ideas and how could be developed more. To conclude and resume, the ingredients, I propose that the ingredients of terror wars, we can say that these wars are characterized by 6 elements. Yeah. The first is the aim of territorial conquest. The second is the use of terror as a weapon of war. The third is that these wars, these contemporary wars, are blurring very much between civil and military domains. The fourth characteristic is the presence of a certain type of reckless, sometimes corrupt, demagogic leader. Well, it is more than that, actually. Then they are characterized by a certain connection between, of course, the leader and the group self. There is a special connection to which I'm missing here, adjectives for this bond between the leader and the group self of these large groups involved in current wars. And the sixth is the revival of an identity theme related to the connection with the land or territory. So I would say this talk offers a few provisional conclusions. More appropriately, it opens to our discussion and reflections, indicating the functioning of the group self as the main domain of study, of further research, I would say. Particular attention should be paid to interplay between consciousness and unconscious in the dynamic between individual and group, and in the bipolar dynamic between groups. And we should study more, I think, the influences of the position of the individual within the group on these dynamics and the functioning of the individual self. What are the mechanisms through which we are projecting onto the group, ours and the others group, and how the threshold between consciousness and the unconscious moves in these dynamics. Furthermore, it may be helpful to theorize more on the concept of a group self, a notion implicitly addressed in Jung's work in many ways, talking of elaborating on the idea of collective unconscious, on the notions of archetypes, on the idea of national psychology. Of course, I find that Henderson, Singer, Kimball, Sperry, Papadopoulos, Hillman works have developed helpful concepts to fill the gaps in Jung's theory. Papadopoulos' research into the significant role of terror goes beyond traditional views of terrorism, revealing crucial insights into the automatic behaviors of individuals and groups when overwhelmed by fear. The strong phenomenology of the self, I think maybe this is my main, let's say, conclusion. The strong phenomenology of the self in both its positive and negative aspects could shed light on group behaviors under both peaceful and wartime conditions. Nonetheless, it appears essential to grasp what the significance of the connection between the group self and the land is for the group itself. And I'm very curious about this topic. What is the group deriving from the connection with the environment, with the material environment it is inhabiting? the dynamics within the group, as well as between individuals, readers, and group members, and the interactions between subgroups need to be examined more thoroughly. Their actions and dynamics during times of peace and conflict should be investigated further, along with how a political context can transition from one state to another. I'm stopping here, closing my slide share. And hoping you are still alive after this long reading also of well-known authors, I have to say, but I also intended this seminar more as a review, of Jungian insights and ideas on this topic, to leave also the space for our reflections and to listen also to you.
Thank you very much for this excellent presentation. And we have about some 25 minutes for conversation.
Yeah.
Since we're very few in the group, if you want, you can simply raise your hand and then unmute yourselves. And if there's more people, we'll just like organize the participations. Yes, Dr. Gottfried.
Thank you, Monica.
Yeah.
I understood most of what you presented from in the very traditional psychological attitude of how Freud started with the all-knowing analyst and the patient who basically doesn't know anything. Since then, a relational aspect has developed, thanks to Otto Gross and then adapted by Jung, where the patient, I mean, in your presentation, the group is a participant, just as the psychologist Jung is a participant, and Jung never seemed to have seen himself as a participant. And I mean, please don't misunderstand me. I'm not trying to argue for Hitler, but when you say Jung analyzed Hitler as being identified with the archetype, the Talmud says we do not see things as they are, we see things as we are. It should be mentioned, I think, that Jung himself strongly identified with the archetype of God and the wise old man and all that. And he distanced himself from any participation. And Levin, as wonderful as this book is in many aspects, Levin leaves out Jung's anti-Semitism, for example, and Jung's abject failure after the war, when he spoke with a leading rabbi in his attitude towards the Holocaust. Jung just said, when confronted with saying, well, you didn't say very much about that, I slipped, which is a shameful excuse. And so I'm missing a critical aspect. I'm also missing a how do the things that you have presented, how do they come into the consulting room? I mean, I've been working as an analyst for 50 years. In these years, there have been 2 patients who have taken responsibility in terms of their forebears for participation in colonial wars, 2 women, and nobody else has seen this, has seen the necessity to take responsibility. And I'm interested in, for example, how do the things that you speak about, how do they present themselves in the consulting room? How do Italian people, assuming many of your patients are Italians, how do they reflect on what Italy does with the refugees from North Africa, for example? I feel deeply affected, for example, living in London, England, by the way refugees are continuously drowning, trying to reach the country where I'm living quite comfortably. So I would have liked to know something, to learn something more about that. Sorry, and one final thing. I think the Jung's and possibly Hillman's notion that aggression is a primary urge is not necessarily agreed with by many other people. So there are other theorists who say that it is secondary, not a primary aspect of human behavior. Sorry, that's all.
Thank you, Gottfried. Well, I'm not sure I can answer all your questions. Maybe you have also to help me to remember all of them. Well, my intent, I don't want to sound apologetic, but my intent was to just to review humbly what something, because I didn't review everything, of course, something that Jung wrote about war, because I was interested in understanding his ideas about the causes of war. I understand that you have a different position on the topic, not the same as Levin. I relied on his work for some of these ideas, but not everything, of course. So what I was trying to do was only to understand what he thought about the causes of war, the psychological experience of a national group involved in war, and I collected, all the different from different texts, his observations. Of course, this needs, a much deeper and more analytic review. But what I was trying to do is just, have a grasp of what he wrote, what he thought about group psychology under conditions of war, and about his comments on Hitler. I was struck simply, maybe because it is resonating with current, with what we are observing today. So I resonated with his description of him like being sort of two very different persons, to the very different persons. One very almost like a child, very a very small person, shy and a small person, I would say, and the other one, you know, being the mask, the demagogue, the blatant, you know, manipulating leader of masses. Probably I resonated, you know, too much with the ideas that I found helpful or fitting with some aspect of our reality. And for sure, I think also Levin is saying something about the fact that Jung probably wasn't. He says that I don't know. This is what Levin is saying, that Jung was critical towards Hitler. Instead, he was more sympathetic towards other dictators like Mussolini. And actually, I was looking at what Jung said on Mussolini, and actually it's a bit upsetting, kind of that he found that despite he was a dictator, he had a kind of warm personality, and he was more genuine in his, you know, in his role, and exciting crowds, and so I'm a bit I'm scrambling a little bit to understand what was your point about this. Given that I'm just, you know, I'm not supporting anything here, just trying to understand what Jung was saying about leaders, about group members in a war situation, and in what he called mass psychosis, psychic infections, and so on. And I was interested also in understanding what how he understood the causes of war. And I have to say that I found, you know, these different levels of analysis. Some excerpts are referring to more social and systemic causes. Others are more psychological analysis. And so I have more questions than answers. I'm wondering how they can, you know, how they can go together. And about taking responsibility and patience. Well, it happens to me to have different kind of people with different, or differently oriented in terms of politics. And I'm thinking, well, some of them are expressing their concern, but I have also people in therapy who are very disturbing, and they are making very disturbing, you know, declarations and about this topic. And I'm surprised that I have one person actually with this kind of attitude, and I think he's kind of provocative towards me. Maybe he knows what's my commitment, but but I think it's not the only reason. Maybe he's also genuinely thinking what he's saying. Yeah, it's very difficult to bear it, and also to I was surprised that I was able to keep him in therapy. Very surprised. I think I haven't I couldn't give you the answer maybe you were looking for, but just please keep repeating if you, help me to stay on track with your questions and your doubts.
Just one very, very brief thing in the way you present. I mean, first, Jung was very enthusiastic about Hitler also in 1933 in his radio interview. And secondly, what you took from Jung and Hillman, there is no space for hope at all.
Oh, yeah, you're right.
And that's
you're right. No,
that's history from my point of view.
Well, actually, my impression, I'm sharing just impression really humbly, because I'm not, I'm not, such an expert on the topic. I'm very interested, and I'm working on it. But my impression is that, well, my favorite writing, Jung's among Jung writings, my favorite is After the Catastrophe, maybe because it's the one where he is more reflective and maybe humbled by the events. And but yeah, probably I miss the overall view on his writings and on his declarations, probably. And for sure, he resonated. This is not only our impression, but also others have written on that. He resonated with some aspects of the character of these dictators. And maybe this is what is making us discuss a lot. What is, can make the discussion more controversial.
Thank you. Yes, Robert wanted to speak, and we have about 7 minutes. So just to acknowledge the time, if anyone has to leave at the hour, thank you for being here, and thank you very much for your presentation, Monica. But we still have some time for Robert.
Yeah, Monica, I wanted to say thank you very much for this presentation. I think it's very important in the way you outline some of the current conflicts that are going on in the world today, and how your psychological presentation of this is really right on and very important to this group particularly. I think that what Gottfried was referring to when he said it lacked hope was that you didn't get into the fact that war also evokes the warrior spirit, which is also an archetype. And it's an archetype that transcends the mass psyche of the war. So that was one topic that it's a whole topic in itself. So I can understand that it was not current in this particular presentation, but I think it should be mentioned that the archetypal warrior spirit is something that can transcend these situations. And in particular, I like to use the example of Ukraine, because Ukraine was invaded. So you have this defensive attitude of the warriors, of the Ukrainian warriors, who really very much represent the warrior spirit, the archetypal warrior spirit in that particular conflict. And my conflict was the Vietnam War, in which I felt very much that the warrior spirit was very much betrayed by the military-industrial complex. But that's a whole different story. Anyway, I just wanted to make that comment about the warrior spirit and the fact that war does evoke that in people to transcend the mass psyche that has perpetrated the war.
Thank you, Robert. Thank you. Yeah, maybe, yeah, what you are saying is adding a very good part, a very good piece of to the discourse. I didn't address it at all, actually. And about hope, I think that I'm approaching this topic not with an intention of giving or not giving hope. I'm saying something more personal here. My hope is really in the human possibility of understanding and of experiencing and knowing more about what is making things how they are. I mean, I don't think that a talk should be hopeful. I think that a talk should indicate what we know and what we don't know yet, and what we should investigate more. If we are looking for hope in a theory, maybe we are considering that the theory is all enclosed and finished, complete. Instead, I have the feeling that we know not enough on why we are keeping engaging in wars. For sure, the what you call the warrior spirit, Robert, is for sure a beautiful aspects of it. Can be, but there is also the other side of the coin, because the warrior spirit could also be declined in on the side of the aggressor, not only of the defender.
Well, that's what I say about the warrior spirit, is the warrior spirit is able to transcend that kind of mass psyche that's involved in war, particularly the one where the hatred of the enemy, for example, the dehumanization of the enemy. The warrior spirit does not dehumanize the enemy. It accepts the human aspect of the enemy as much as the human aspect of the side that you're on. It's an archetypal elevation of the spirit there's a soldier, the mass soldier, and then there's the warrior spirit. So there's that difference between the two.
Yeah, sure.
Battlefield.
There is.
And it's very evident on the battlefield. I mean, I saw it in Vietnam, and you see it in any real good depiction of any kind of a war film, and there are plenty of war films. But I'm particularly impressed with Zelensky in Ukraine, and with the fighting forces in Ukraine, because they are defenders of their own land. They're defenders of the Gaia, of the mother aspect of their own identities, which is connected with that land. But it is a whole different topic than what you were talking about. That's true.
No, but it's,
much
of course,
broader aspect.
It fits very well.
But what you had to say was very important today about what's going on with the conflicts that are going on today. It's very important. Thank you very much for that.
Thank you for listening. Thank you.
Yes, once again, thank you everyone for being here. Thank you, Dr. Luci, for furthering more thought, right, on this topic, which I think is very important within the Jungian world, in the face of archetypal possession, to try to think through what is happening. And well, thank you very much once again. And we'll see you at our next seminar, hopefully.
Thank you. Thank you for the patience.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Have a great day.
Thank you. And you. Bye-bye.